Jake Martinez felt the ship shake around him as alarms screamed through the corridors. The experimental jump drive that was supposed to take the Aurora safely through space had gone wrong in the worst possible way. Sparks flew from control panels as the crew ran back and forth trying to fix what could not be fixed. Jake grabbed onto a metal rail as the floor tilted under his feet. "All hands to escape pods," Captain Stevens shouted over the noise. Jake ran toward the escape bay, but another explosion threw him against the wall. His head hit metal and everything went dark for a moment. When he opened his eyes, the corridor was full of smoke and the ship was falling fast. Jake crawled through the broken hallways looking for any escape pod that still worked. Most were already gone or too damaged to use. He found one pod at the very back of the ship that looked like it might still function. The door was stuck, but Jake used a metal bar to force it open. He threw himself inside just as another explosion rocked the ship. The escape pod shot away from the Aurora just in time. Through the small window, Jake watched his ship break apart in space. Pieces of metal and equipment scattered in all directions. He was alone now in a tiny pod with limited air and power. The pod's computer said it was heading toward a planet, but Jake had no way to control where he would land. The planet below looked strange with purple clouds swirling around it. Jake could see what looked like cities floating high above the cloud layer. The cities were made of crystal and metal that caught the light from the planet's sun. They were beautiful, but completely alien. Jake had never seen anything like them. In all his years as an engineer, the escape pod hit the atmosphere hard and started to burn. Jake held on tight as the pod spun and shook. The landing system was supposed to slow the pod down, but something was wrong. He was coming in too fast and the ground was rushing up to meet him. Jake closed his eyes and hoped for the best. The crash was terrible. Metal screamed against rock, and Jake felt like he was being shaken apart. The pod bounced twice and then slid for what felt like forever before finally stopping. Jake's head was bleeding and his arm hurt badly, but he was alive. Smoke filled the pod and he could smell something burning. He had to get out fast. Jake forced the damaged door open and crawled outside onto alien ground. The air was thin but breathable. Strange plants with silver leaves grew all around the crash site. In the distance, he could see one of the floating cities moving slowly across the sky. It was even more amazing up close with towers that seemed to be made of living crystal. Jake tried to stand, but his hurt arm made him dizzy. He sat back down and looked at the wreckage of his escape pod. There was no way to call for help and no way to leave this planet. He was stuck here until someone found him or until he died. The thought made him feel cold, despite the warm alien sun. He did not have to wait long. 3 beings came walking toward him from the direction of some strange vehicles Jake had not noticed before. They were tall and thin with skin that looked like it was made of pale blue crystal. Their faces were similar to humans, but longer and more angular. They wore robes that seemed to shimmer in the light. The leader of the 3 aliens stopped a safe distance away and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. Jake could not understand the words, but somehow the meaning appeared in his mind. The alien was asking if he was hurt and what kind of creature he was. Jake realized these beings had some way to communicate directly with thoughts. "I am human," Jake said out loud, hoping they would understand. "My ship crashed and I am hurt." The 3 aliens looked at each other and Jake could sense their surprise. The leader stepped closer and touched a device on his wrist. Jake felt a strange tingling in his head and suddenly he could understand their words clearly. "A human," the leader said with what seemed like amazement. "We have heard of your kind but never seen one so far from your home system. You are very far from Earth, little primitive one." The word primitive stung Jake, but he was in no position to argue. These beings had technology that could translate languages instantly and cities that floated in the sky. Compared to them, humans probably did seem primitive. "I am High Architect Zorvanth," the leader continued. "We will take you to our city and heal your injuries. You are fortunate that we were testing equipment nearby when your crude vessel fell from the sky." The other 2 aliens brought forward a device that looked like a floating stretcher made of the same crystal material as their skin. They helped Jake onto it gently despite their obvious belief that he was inferior to them. The stretcher rose into the air and began moving toward their vehicles. Jake got his first close look at alien technology as they traveled toward the floating city. The vehicles had no visible engines but moved silently through the air. Everything was made of materials that seemed to grow rather than be built. It was beautiful, but also showed Jake just how far behind his own people were. As they flew up toward the floating city, Jake saw that it was much larger than it had appeared from the ground. Thousands of crystal buildings connected by bridges and walkways stretched in all directions. Gardens with impossible plants hung in the air between towers. People moved along paths that seemed to be made of solid light. But Jake also noticed things that the aliens seemed to ignore. Some of the crystal buildings were dark and empty. Several bridges looked damaged or incomplete. Gardens that should have been floating were falling toward the toxic clouds below. The city was magnificent, but something was wrong with it. The aliens brought Jake to a medical facility where machines that looked more like living creatures examined his injuries. The healing process felt strange but worked incredibly well. Within an hour, his broken arm was completely fixed and the cuts on his head had vanished without leaving scars. "You will stay here until we can arrange transport back to human space," Zorventh told him when the healing was complete. "It may take some time as your kind rarely ventures so far from home. Until then, you will be kept comfortable and safe." Jake thanked the High Architect, but his engineer's mind was already working. He had seen the failing systems in the city during their flight upward. These aliens might think humans were primitive, but Jake had spent his whole life fixing things that other people thought could not be fixed. Maybe there was more he could do here than just wait for rescue. That night, as Jake lay in the comfortable room they had given him, he could hear strange sounds from the city around him. Machinery that should have been running smoothly was making grinding noises. Power systems were fluctuating, causing lights to flicker. The great floating city was in trouble, and its people either could not see it or did not know how to fix it. Jake smiled despite his situation. He was an engineer and there was broken technology all around him. Maybe the aliens thought he was primitive, but they were about to learn what human ingenuity could accomplish. Jake woke up the next morning to the sound of something breaking in the distance. Through the crystal window of his room, he could see smoke rising from one of the city's outer sections. The Vilethani people below were moving around frantically, but no one seemed to know what to do about the problem. Jake watched as they simply blocked off the damaged area and moved everyone away from it. A young Vilethani female came to bring Jake his morning meal. She was different from the others Jake had met because she carried tools and had stains on her robes that looked like grease or oil. When she saw Jake watching the smoke outside, she sighed deeply. "Another system failure," she said sadly. "The third one this week. Soon we will have to abandon that entire section of the city." "What kind of system?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. The young alien looked at him with surprise. "You are interested in our technology?" she asked. "Most primitive species only care about food and shelter." Jake decided to ignore the word primitive again. "I am an engineer. I fix things for a living." "What is your name?" "I am called Lyrian," she replied. "I study the old machines, but I am not very good at it. No one is anymore. The knowledge was lost long ago." Jake felt excited despite trying to hide it. Here was someone who actually worked with the failing technology. Maybe he could learn something useful from her. "Would you show me some of these machines?" Jake asked. "I promise I will not touch anything or cause problems." Lyrian looked nervous but also curious. "High Architect Zorventh said you should be kept comfortable, but he did not say you could not see our city. I suppose there would be no harm in showing you some things." For the next several days, Lyrian took Jake on tours through different parts of the floating city. What Jake saw both amazed and worried him. The Vilethani had technology that seemed impossible by human standards. They could manipulate gravity to make things float. They could create matter from energy using machines the size of closets. They had power sources that seemed to run on nothing but empty space itself. But all of this incredible technology was failing piece by piece. The gravity generators that kept the city floating were working harder than they should. The matter creators were producing flawed materials. The power sources were becoming unstable and dangerous. Worst of all, the Vilethani seemed to accept this decay as natural and unavoidable. "Our ancestors built these machines using techniques we no longer understand. Lyrian explained as they stood before a massive device that hummed with barely controlled energy. They could connect their minds directly to the technology and guide it with their thoughts. We have lost that ability over many generations. Jake studied the machine carefully. It was beautiful in an alien way, with flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color in the light. But underneath the exotic appearance, Jake could see familiar patterns. Energy moved through the device in ways that followed the same rules Jake had learned in engineering school. The machine was just following physics, even if it did so in ways humans had never discovered. "What does this machine do?" Jake asked. "It processes the air for the entire Eastern District," Lyrian said. "It removes toxins and adds the gases we need to breathe, but it has been working poorly for years. The air in that district is becoming dangerous." Jake walked around the machine, looking at it from different angles. There were no obvious control panels or interfaces that he could understand, but there were places where energy flowed in and out. He could see stress points where the beautiful crystal structure was beginning to crack. Most importantly, he could see places where the machine was working against itself instead of in harmony. "Have you tried cleaning the intake valves?" Jake asked. Lyrian looked at him strangely. "Cleaning," she repeated as if the word made no sense. "The machine is supposed to maintain itself. Our ancestors built it to be perfect." "Nothing is perfect," Jake said gently. "Everything needs maintenance. Even the best machines break down if you do not take care of them." Over the following days, Jake convinced Lyrian to show him more of the city's infrastructure. They visited power plants and transportation systems. They looked at the massive computers that controlled city operations and the delicate equipment that kept the floating gardens alive. Everywhere, Jake saw the same pattern of incredible technology that was slowly dying from lack of basic care. The Valthani treated their machines like living things that should be able to heal themselves. When something broke, they either tried to replace the entire system, or they simply gave up and abandoned that area. They never considered that complex technology might need regular maintenance and careful monitoring to keep working properly. Jake began to understand why the city was failing. The original Valthani engineers had built machines that could partly maintain themselves through biological connections. When later generations lost the ability to form those connections, the machines had no way to communicate their needs. They were like sick patients who could not tell their doctors what was wrong. But Jake also realized something that the Valthani had missed. Their technology might be incredibly advanced, but it still followed the same basic principles that governed all machines. Energy had to flow efficiently. Moving parts had to be properly aligned. Heat had to be managed correctly. Waste products had to be removed. These rules worked the same whether you were building a human car engine or an alien gravity generator. "Lyrian," Jake said one day as they watched another section of the city lose power, "what if I told you there might be ways to fix some of these problems without the biological connections your ancestors used?" Lyrian looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You are only a primitive human. How could you understand technology that our greatest minds cannot repair?" "Maybe because I am primitive," Jake said with a smile. "Sometimes when you know too much about how something is supposed to work, you cannot see simple solutions to basic problems." Before Lyrian could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the city. Jake could see people running in panic toward the emergency shelters. Through the crystal windows, he watched as a massive cloud of green gas began pouring out of one of the city's main atmospheric processors. The poisonous fog was spreading quickly toward the residential areas. "We have to evacuate the eastern districts," Lyrian said with tears in her eyes. "Another processor has failed completely. Soon we will have nowhere left to live." Jake watched the green gas spreading and made a decision that would change everything. While the Valthani organized their evacuation, he quietly slipped away from Lyrian and headed toward the failing atmospheric processor. He might be just a primitive human, but he was also an engineer who had never met a machine he could not understand. The corridors were empty as everyone fled from the toxic gas. Jake found an emergency breathing mask and protective suit designed for Valthani bodies. It was too big for him but would have to work. He put on the clumsy equipment and headed into the dangerous area. The atmospheric processor was a massive machine built into the side of one of the city's main towers. Green gas poured from several openings in its crystal surface. Warning lights flashed and automated voices spoke in the Valthani language telling everyone to stay away. Jake ignored the warnings and approached the machine carefully. Up close, he could see that the processor was not actually broken. The crystal housing was intact and energy still flowed through its internal systems. But the machine was clearly struggling with something. It reminded Jake of a clogged drain that could not handle the flow of water being pushed through it. Jake began his examination the same way he would approach any unfamiliar machine. He looked for inputs and outputs. He traced the flow of energy and materials. He identified the major components and tried to understand how they worked together. The technology was alien, but the basic engineering principles were universal. After an hour of careful study, Jake found what he was looking for. Deep inside the machine, where the Valthani could not see without dismantling everything, was a filtration system that had become completely blocked. The organic filters that were supposed to clean themselves had been overwhelmed by years of accumulated waste. The machine was essentially choking on its own garbage. Jake looked at the problem and smiled. This was something he could fix. Jake stared at the blocked filtration system inside the massive atmospheric processor. The green toxic gas continued to pour out around him, but he could see exactly what needed to be done. The organic filters were clogged with years of accumulated waste that should have been cleaned away automatically. Without the biological interface the Valthani ancestors had used, the machine could not maintain itself properly. He pulled tools from his belt that he had borrowed from the maintenance areas. Lyrian had shown him. The Valthani tools were strange in his hands, but they worked on the same basic principles as human equipment. Jake found access panels that looked like they had not been opened in decades. The crystal material was beautiful, but it opened just like any other maintenance hatch when you applied pressure in the right places. Inside the machine, Jake could see the filtration system clearly. It was incredibly complex with layers of organic material that could break down toxins and convert them into harmless gases. But the entire system was choked with thick black sludge that prevented air from flowing through properly. The machine was trying to force contaminated air through blocked filters and failing badly. Jake began the careful process of cleaning the filters. He worked slowly because he did not want to damage the delicate organic components. The sludge came away in thick chunks that smelled terrible, even through his breathing mask. As he worked, Jake noticed that the flow of toxic gas from the machine began to slow down. The job took 3 hours of careful work. Jake had to crawl through narrow spaces inside the machine and use tools in ways they were probably not designed for. Several times he thought he might be making things worse, but he kept going. His engineering training told him that a clean filtration system had to work better than a clogged one. When Jake finally cleared the last of the blocked filters, something amazing happened. The atmospheric processor gave a sound like a deep breath and suddenly began working perfectly. Clean air flowed out of the outputs while the green toxic gas stopped completely. Warning lights changed from red to blue, and the automated voices switched to what sounded like status reports instead of emergency warnings. Jake climbed out of the machine covered in alien sludge but grinning widely. He had done it. He had fixed technology that the Valthani thought was beyond repair using nothing but basic maintenance techniques that any human engineer would know. "What have you done?" a voice said behind him. Jake turned to see Lyrian standing in the doorway, with her mouth open in shock. She was wearing a protective suit like his and carrying a scanner that was beeping rapidly. "I cleaned the filters," Jake said simply. The machine was not broken, it was just clogged up with waste products. Lyrian stared at her scanner in disbelief. "This is impossible. The atmospheric processor is showing full efficiency for the first time in my lifetime. The air quality readings are better than they have been in years. How did you do this?" Jake tried to explain what he had found inside the machine, but Lyrian seemed unable to understand his methods. She kept asking about biological interfaces and mental connections that Jake had not used. When he told her he had simply cleaned out the accumulated waste, she looked at him like he was speaking in a foreign language. "But the machine is supposed to maintain itself," Lyrian insisted. "Our ancestors designed it to be perfect and self-sufficient." "Your ancestors were smart," Jake said patiently, "but they were not gods. They built a machine that could partly maintain itself, but it still needed regular care. When your people lost the ability to provide that care, the machine started to fail slowly. Before Lyrian could respond, they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. High Architect Zorvanth appeared with several other important-looking Valthani. They all carried scanners and wore expressions of confusion and suspicion. "What is happening here?" Zorvanth demanded. "Our monitoring systems show that the atmospheric processor is functioning at levels we have not seen in generations. Did you damage other systems to create this illusion, primitive human?" Jake felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "I did not damage anything. I fixed the machine by cleaning out its filters. You can check for yourself." Zorvanth and the other Valthani spent the next hour examining the atmospheric processor with their advanced scanners. They took readings from every part of the machine and compared them to historical data. Finally, Zorvanth had to admit that the machine was not only working properly, but was actually functioning better than it had in decades. "This should not be possible," one of the other Valthani said. "The human has no biological interface capability. He cannot communicate with our technology the way our ancestors did." "Maybe that is exactly why he could fix it," Lyrian said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her in surprise. "Maybe our ancestors built the machines too well. They made them so advanced that we forgot they were still just machines that need basic care." Zorvanth looked at Jake with new interest. "Explain to me exactly what you did inside the atmospheric processor." Jake walked them through his repair process step by step. He showed them the clogged filters and explained how cleaning them had restored proper airflow. He demonstrated basic principles of fluid dynamics and filtration that applied whether you were working with human or Valthani technology. The aliens listened carefully, but Jake could see they were struggling to understand his approach. They had spent so many generations thinking of their technology as mystical and biological that they had forgotten the mechanical principles underneath. "These methods you describe," Zorvanth said slowly, "they are very primitive and basic." "Yes, they are," Jake agreed. "Sometimes basic solutions work better than complex ones." As they were talking, alarms began sounding again throughout the city. This time it was not a single machine failure, but something much worse. Through the crystal windows, Jake could see that several sections of the city were flickering like dying light bulbs. The main power grid that kept the entire floating city in the air was beginning to fail. Emergency announcements echoed through the corridors, telling everyone to prepare for possible evacuation to the planet's surface. Jake knew that would be a death sentence for most of the Valthani, because the air below the clouds was too toxic for them to breathe even with protective equipment. "How long before the city falls?" Jake asked Lyrian. "Maybe 6 hours if we are lucky," she replied with tears in her eyes. "The main power plant has been unstable for months. We have tried everything we know to fix it, but nothing works. Soon it will fail completely, and the gravity generators will stop working." Jake looked at the panicking Valthani around him and made another decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Take me to the power plant," he said to Zorvanth. "Let me see what is wrong with it." "Absolutely not," Zorvanth replied immediately. "The power plant is the most dangerous and complex system in our entire city. If you damage it while trying your primitive repair methods, you could kill everyone. And if I do nothing, everyone dies anyway when the city crashes," Jake pointed out. "What do you have to lose by letting me try?" Zorvanth stared at Jake for a long moment. Around them, the city shook slightly as power fluctuations affected the gravity generators. Finally, the High Architect nodded reluctantly. "Very well, human. Engineer," he said. "You fixed one impossible problem today. Perhaps you can fix another. But if you fail, we will all face the consequences together." As they hurried through the corridors toward the city's power plant, Jake felt both excitement and terror. The atmospheric processor had been complicated, but the main power grid would be far more complex and dangerous. One mistake could destroy everything. But Jake also felt something else. For the first time since his ship had crashed, he felt like he was doing what he was meant to do. He was an engineer facing the biggest challenge of his life, and he was not going to let fear stop him from trying. The power plant was located at the very center of the floating city in a massive chamber that seemed to exist in its own pocket of space. As they approached it, Jake could hear the sound of machinery that was clearly struggling. Whatever was powering this incredible city was on the edge of complete failure. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to face technology that was beyond anything humans had ever built. But he was beginning to understand that no matter how advanced a machine might be, it still had to follow the basic rules of engineering that governed everything in the universe. The power plant chamber was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The room seemed to stretch in all directions with no visible walls or ceiling. In the center floated a massive structure that looked like a crystal flower the size of a building. Energy flowed through its transparent petals in patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. But Jake could hear immediately that something was very wrong with the beautiful machine. The sound it made was like a giant engine that was badly out of tune. Instead of the smooth hum of properly functioning equipment, Jake heard grinding noises and irregular pulses that meant serious mechanical problems. Worse yet, he could see that several of the crystal petals were cracked, and one was flickering like a dying light bulb. "This is our primary fusion core," Zorvanth explained as they stood on a platform that floated near the massive machine. "It has provided power for our city for over 1,000 years without interruption, but in recent months it has become increasingly unstable." Jake walked around the platform studying the fusion core from different angles. The technology was so advanced that he could barely understand how it worked, but the signs of trouble were clear to any engineer. Energy was not flowing evenly through the system. Heat was building up in places where it should have been distributed. Most importantly, the machine was fighting against itself instead of working in harmony. "What happens when your people try to fix problems with this machine?" Jake asked. "We replace damaged components," Lyrian answered. "When one of the crystal formations fails, we grow a new one and install it. But the replacements never work as well as the originals, and they fail more quickly each time." Jake nodded as he began to understand the real problem. You are treating symptoms instead of fixing the disease. When a part fails, you replace it, but you never ask why it failed in the first place. "But our ancestors designed the fusion core to be perfect," another Velthani engineer protested. "The components should not fail if they are properly grown and installed." "Perfect design does not mean perfect operation," Jake said patiently. "Even the best machine will develop problems over time if it is not properly maintained. Your ancestors probably had procedures for keeping this system balanced, but that knowledge was lost." Jake spent the next 2 hours studying the fusion core, while the city shook around them with increasing violence. The gravity generators were already beginning to fail as power became more erratic. They had maybe 4 hours before the floating city would start its final descent toward the toxic clouds below. Working with Lyrian and several other young Velthani engineers, Jake began mapping the energy flows through the fusion core. He could not understand the advanced physics that made the machine work, but he could see patterns in how energy moved through the system. More importantly, he could see where those patterns were being disrupted. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to a section where energy flowed in tight spirals through crystal conduits. "The energy is backing up here because something is blocking the normal flow. That causes heat to build up, which damages the crystal, which creates more blockages." "But what could be blocking the energy flow?" Lyrian asked. "The conduits are made of pure crystal that should not degrade." Jake studied the problem more carefully. He borrowed a portable scanner from one of the Velthani and aimed it at the problematic area. The readings showed something that surprised everyone. There were tiny impurities in the crystal conduits that were disrupting the energy flow. "Where do these impurities come from?" Jake asked. "They should not exist," Zorvanth said with frustration. "The crystal growing process creates perfectly pure materials." Jake thought about the problem from an engineering perspective. If impurities were appearing in a system that was supposed to create perfect crystals, then something in that system was not working correctly. He asked to see the crystal growing facility that created replacement components for the fusion core. The crystal growing facility was located in another part of the power plant complex. It was a beautiful chamber where raw materials were converted into the exotic crystals that made Velthani technology possible. But Jake immediately noticed problems that the aliens had missed. The growing chambers were not properly sealed. Tiny amounts of contamination were getting into the crystal formation process. The temperature controls were slightly off, causing uneven growth patterns. Most importantly, the timing sequences that controlled crystal formation had drifted away from their optimal settings over decades of use. Your crystal growing process is like a recipe, Jake explained to the watching Valthani. If any of the ingredients or steps are wrong, the final product will not be perfect. Over time, small errors add up to big problems. Working quickly, Jake began adjusting the crystal growing facility. He sealed the contamination leaks using materials from his crashed escape pod. He recalibrated the temperature controls by comparing current readings to the optimal ranges he found in old maintenance logs. Most importantly, he reset the timing sequences to their original factory settings. How do you know what the correct settings should be? Lyrian asked as she watched Jake work. Because machines always remember their original programming even if people forget it, Jake replied. You just have to know where to look for the information. While Jake worked on the crystal growing facility, Lyrian and the other Valthani engineers began implementing his suggestions for the main fusion core. They started by cleaning energy conduits using techniques that Jake had borrowed from human pipe cleaning methods. They recalibrated sensors that had drifted out of alignment over the centuries. They even performed basic maintenance procedures that had been ignored for generations. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Jake had to create new tools using salvaged parts from his escape pod and Valthani components. Several times they had to stop work as power fluctuations made the fusion core too unstable to approach safely. But slowly, they began to see improvements. The irregular pulses that had plagued the fusion core for months began to smooth out. Energy flow became more even as blockages were cleared. Most importantly, the machine stopped fighting against itself and began working in harmony again. I cannot believe this is working, one of the older Valthani engineers said as he watched the fusion core stabilize. We have tried for years to solve these problems using advanced techniques. How can primitive maintenance methods be more effective? Because sometimes the best solution is the simplest one, Jake replied as he wiped sweat from his forehead. Your ancestors built an incredible machine, but they also built it to follow basic engineering principles. When you forgot those principles, you lost the ability to maintain their creation properly. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the fusion core's control system was not actually broken, but was receiving incorrect feedback from sensors that had gradually drifted out of calibration. The machine was trying to compensate for problems that did not actually exist, which created real problems in the process. It is like a person who thinks they are sick when they are actually healthy, Jake explained to Lyrian. They take medicine they do not need, which makes them actually sick. Your fusion core has been trying to fix problems that were only measurement errors. By carefully recalibrating the sensor network, Jake was able to restore proper feedback to the fusion core's control system. The machine immediately began operating more efficiently as it stopped trying to compensate for non-existent problems. As the hours passed, the improvements became more and more obvious. The city stopped shaking as the gravity generators received steady power. The lights stopped flickering as energy distribution stabilized. Most importantly, the fusion core began producing more power than it had in years while running more safely than before. We did it, Lyrian said with tears of joy in her eyes as she watched the fusion core return to perfect operation. The city is saved. But Jake was already thinking beyond this immediate crisis. One repaired machine would not solve all of the Valthani's problems. Throughout the city, there were thousands of other systems that needed the same kind of basic maintenance and care. The real challenge would be teaching the Valthani how to maintain their own technology so these problems would not happen again. This is just the beginning, Jake told the celebrating engineers around him. Now we need to teach your people how to keep their machines working properly so you never face this kind of crisis again. Zorvanth approached Jake with an expression of amazement and respect that had not been there before. Human engineer, he said formally, you have saved our city and our people. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You do not owe me anything, Jake replied. But I would like to ask for something. Let me teach your people what I have learned about maintaining your technology. Help me start a school where young Valthani can learn engineering principles that will keep your civilization strong. Zorvanth nodded slowly. It will be done. You have proven that there is wisdom in your primitive methods that we have overlooked. Perhaps it is time for our people to learn new ways of thinking about the machines our ancestors built. As J.K. looked around at the perfectly functioning fusion core, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had not just fixed a machine, he had helped save an entire civilization. 6 months after Jake had saved the floating city, word of the human engineer's achievements had spread throughout Valthani space. Every day brought new visitors to the city seeking Jake's help with their own failing technology. Delegations arrived, from distant worlds where ancient machines were breaking down and no one knew how to fix them. Jake stood in what had once been an empty crystal chamber, but was now the first interspecies engineering academy in known history. Young Valthani, students sat alongside human visitors who had arrived when Earth finally sent a rescue mission. The classroom was filled with a mixture of advanced alien technology and basic human tools that somehow worked better together than either did alone. Remember, Jake told his students as he demonstrated proper maintenance procedures on a gravity generator. Every machine follows the same basic rules no matter how advanced it might appear. Energy must flow efficiently, moving parts must be properly aligned, heat must be managed correctly. These principles work whether you are fixing a human car or a Valthani starship. Lyrian had become Jake's most dedicated student and was now teaching classes of her own. She had learned to think like a human engineer while still understanding the advanced principles behind Valthani technology. Her students were the first generation of Valthani in centuries who truly understood how their ancestors' machines actually worked. The most important lesson Jake taught us, Lyrian explained to a group of new students, is that understanding is more valuable than mystery. Our ancestors built incredible machines, but they were still just machines that followed natural laws. When we stopped trying to understand them and started treating them like magic, we lost the ability to maintain them properly. The transformation in Valthani society had been remarkable. Engineering had become a respected profession again as young people realized they could understand and improve their ancestors' technology. Instead of just hoping it would continue working, new innovations were being developed that combined human systematic thinking with Valthani, advanced materials, and energy manipulation. Jake walked through the Academy's workshop areas where students were building hybrid devices that neither species could have created alone. Human design principles were being applied to Valthani materials to create tools that were both incredibly advanced and completely reliable. Meanwhile, Valthani energy manipulation techniques were being used to improve human technology in ways that seemed almost magical. "Jake," called Captain Rodriguez as she approached from the Academy's main entrance. She was the commander of the Earth rescue ship that had arrived 3 months ago, expecting to find a single stranded engineer. Instead, she had discovered a human who had become the most important person on an alien world. "The Council of Engineers from the outer colonies has arrived," Rodriguez continued. "They want to discuss expanding the Academy program to their worlds. It seems like every Valthani settlement in this sector has technology problems that only your methods can solve." Jake smiled as he remembered how the Valthani had once called him primitive. Now they were begging him to teach their people the basic engineering principles that humans took for granted. But Jake had learned that the Valthani had knowledge that was equally valuable to share. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow," Jake told Rodriguez. "But make sure they understand that this is not about me personally. The goal is to teach Valthani engineers to solve their own problems using these methods. Speaking of which," Rodriguez said with a grin, "Earth Command wants to know when you are coming home. They are very interested in the Valthani technology you have been studying. Some of the reports you have sent back have caused quite a stir among our scientists." Jake looked around at the bustling academy, filled with both human and Valthani students working together. Through the crystal windows, he could see the floating city functioning perfectly with all its systems running at peak efficiency. In the distance, construction had begun on a new type of shipyard where vessels would be built using hybrid human Valthani technology. "I am not going back to Earth," Jake said quietly. "This is my home now. There is too much work still to be done here." Rodriguez nodded as if she had expected this answer. "I thought you might say that. Earth Command anticipated this possibility and asked me to give you something." She handed Jake a datapad containing official documents from Earth. Jake read through them with growing amazement. He had been appointed as the first human ambassador to the Velthani Confederation, with full authority to negotiate technology sharing agreements and educational exchanges. "It seems like Earth is very interested in learning from your new friends," Rodriguez said. "The initial reports about Velthani technology have convinced our leaders that this partnership could benefit both species enormously." Jake felt excited about the possibilities. Humans could learn from Velthani advances in material science and energy manipulation. Meanwhile, the Velthani could benefit from human systematic thinking and problem-solving methods. Together, the two species could achieve things that neither could accomplish alone. "There is something else," Rodriguez added. "We brought specialists in xenotechnology and several of Earth's best engineers. They want to study here at your academy and learn these hybrid techniques you have developed." Over the following weeks, Jake watched as the academy expanded rapidly. Human and Velthani students learned from each other in ways that surprised everyone. The humans were amazed by Velthani technology that seemed to violate everything they knew about physics. The Velthani were equally amazed by human techniques that could make any machine work better through simple, systematic care. The real breakthrough came when joint human-Velthani engineering teams began developing completely new technologies. They created gravity generators that were more stable than traditional Velthani designs because they incorporated human redundancy and safety systems. They developed matter converters that were more efficient because human optimization techniques improved their energy usage. Most importantly, they began construction of the first true interspecies starship. The vessel would combine human engineering principles with Velthani advanced materials to create something that was both incredibly sophisticated and completely reliable. It would carry mixed crews of both species to explore regions of space that neither could reach alone. Jake stood in the shipyard watching construction of the new vessel and felt proud of what they had accomplished. The ship was beautiful with flowing Velthani curves supported by sturdy human structural engineering. Its power systems used Velthani energy manipulation controlled by human monitoring and safety systems. Every component had been designed using the combined knowledge of both species. "It is magnificent," Lyrian said as she joined Jake on the observation platform. "Our ancestors would never have imagined that we would work so closely with another species. They thought Velthani technology was the pinnacle of achievement in the universe." "Your ancestors were brilliant," Jake replied. "But they were wrong about one thing. The pinnacle of achievement is not what one species can accomplish alone. It is what different species can accomplish when they work together and share their knowledge freely." As the months passed, the Academy became the center of a technological revolution that spread throughout both human and Velthani space. Engineering teams traveled between worlds, sharing techniques and solving problems that had seemed impossible before. Ancient Velthani machines that had failed centuries ago were restored to operation using hybrid maintenance methods. Human technology was improved beyond recognition using Velthani materials and energy systems. But Jake's greatest achievement was not any specific technological advance. It was the knowledge transfer system he had created that ensured no civilization would ever again lose understanding of its own technology. The Academy taught not just specific repair techniques, but systematic thinking methods that could be applied to any problem. Years later, when Jake was old and gray, he would look back on his time crash landing on the Velthani world as the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had found his true purpose not in fixing broken machines, but in building bridges between different ways of thinking about the universe. The floating city that had once been dying now thrived as the center of interspecies cooperation. The toxic clouds below had been cleared away using hybrid atmospheric processors that worked better than anything either species had built alone. Gardens floated freely in clean air, while ships from dozens of worlds came and went carrying students and teachers eager to learn from the Academy. Jake smiled as he watched a group of young engineers working together on a new project. Half were human and half were Velthani, but they functioned as a single team united by their shared understanding that the universe was full of problems waiting to be solved by anyone willing to think systematically and work carefully. The human engineer who had once been dismissed as primitive had proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from the most advanced species, but from those willing to see familiar problems with fresh eyes. Jake had saved more than just a dying city. He had created a new model for how different civilizations could learn from each other and build a better future together.